Dawn had not yet broken over the Tigris River valley when the ground began to tremble. Not from an earthquake, not from thunder rolling in from the mountains of Armenia to the north. The trembling came from hooves. 10,000, then 50,000, then 100,000 iron-shod hooves striking the baked earth of Mesopotamia in a rhythm that felt less like an army marching and more like the heartbeat of some ancient, terrible god waking from a very long sleep. The date was late summer, 359 AD. The place was a black basalt plateau rising above the eastern bank of the Tigris in the frontier province of Mesopotamia, where the Roman Empire ended and everything dangerous began. And on that plateau, behind walls of volcanic stone so thick that siege engines had been breaking against them for generations, 20,000 Roman soldiers and 100,000 terrified civilians pressed their faces to the battlements and watched the horizon disappear. What they saw moving toward them was not an army in the conventional sense. It was a civilization in motion. The forces of Shapur II, King of Kings of the Sassanid Persian Empire, uncoiled across the Mesopotamian plain like a jeweled serpent, stretching from one edge of the known world to the other. Cavalry in coats of iron scales that caught the rising sun and scattered it into 1,000 fractured lights. War elephants moving like grey hills with purpose. Banners of crimson and gold snapping above formations so deep and so wide that experienced Roman officers on the walls above simply stopped counting and started praying. There were Chionite horsemen from the eastern steppes, Albanian cavalry from the Caucasus, Sarka warriors from lands the Romans barely had names for. And at the center of it all, surrounded by his gilded household guard, rode Shapur himself. Wearing a crown shaped like a ram's head, cast in gold and set with rubies, topaz, and pearls the size of a man's thumbnail. But the city watching this approach was not just any city. Amida, the Romans called it the Shield of Mesopotamia, the iron door between Persia and Anatolia, the fortress that had never fallen. Its walls rose from the edge of sheer basalt cliffs on three sides. The Tigris guarded the fourth. A freshwater spring ran inside the walls, meaning it could outlast any siege on water alone. 7 towers of stone and mortar anchored its defenses, and inside those towers crouched artillery crews, archers, and veterans of the eastern frontier who had spent their entire careers preparing for exactly this moment. Rome had not built Amida to be defended. Rome had built Amida to be impossible. On one side, 100,000 of the finest soldiers the ancient world had ever assembled, led by a king who had spent 60 years learning from his failures, and was now, finally, holding the one weapon that no wall in the world could stop. On the other, 20,000 defenders, 100,000 trapped civilians, dwindling supplies, no relief in sight, and the knowledge that the man outside their walls had just signed a death warrant for everyone inside. 73 days. That is how long Amida held. 73 days that bled Persia of 30,000 men, that consumed one of history's great siege operations in fire and fury and grinding attrition. But on day 73, the walls came down. Not because Rome lacked courage, not because the defenders ran. Amida fell because of a piece of paper, or rather what was written on it, because of a bureaucrat who had made one too many enemies, because of a general in a comfortable tent 500 miles away who refused to move, and because of a ramp of dirt that chose the worst possible moment to collapse. This is the story of how Persia shattered Rome's unbreakable defense. And once you understand how it happened, you will never look at a fortress the same way again. The wound was 60 years old, and it had never stopped bleeding. In 298 AD, the Roman Emperor Galerius had crushed the Sassanid Persian army at the Battle of Satala, and followed that victory with a peace treaty so punishing, so deliberately humiliating, that every Persian king for the next 6 decades would wake in the night with the taste of it in his mouth. The Treaty of Nisibis did not merely redraw a border, it reached deep into Persian territory and yanked out the empire's spine. The Romans took the 5 provinces beyond the Tigris River, lands that Persian kings had ruled for generations, lands where Persian gods were worshipped and Persian customs ran as deep as the rivers themselves. They took control of Armenia. They installed friendly rulers in Iberia. And, most galling of all, they pushed the frontier of Roman power from the Euphrates to the Tigris, planting the Eagle of Rome within striking distance of Ctesiphon, the great Sassanid capital. Every time a Persian king looked at a map, he saw Rome sitting on his doorstep with its feet up, smiling. But the man who would finally do something about it was not born into power in the usual way. Shapur II arrived in the world in 309 AD, under circumstances so unusual that they became the stuff of legend almost immediately. His father, the Persian king Hormizd II, died before his son was born, and the Persian nobility, terrified of a regency, terrified of choosing wrong among the existing princes, made a decision that has no parallel in recorded history. They crowned the unborn child. Literally. They placed a diadem on the pregnant belly of the queen and declared the child inside, boy or girl, the King of Kings of the Sassanid Empire. Shapur II was a monarch before he drew his first breath. He wore a crown before he opened his eyes. And when he finally came into the world, screaming, the entire apparatus of one of history's greatest empires was already bent in his direction, waiting. He spent his childhood in a gilded cage of regency councils and court intrigue, watched by nobles who expected to use him. By his mid-teens, he had decided he was done being used. He rode out at the head of a Persian army when most sons of noblemen were still learning to sit a horse properly, and he crushed an Arab confederation that had been raiding Persian territory for years, with a ferocity that made the court nobles blink and reconsider their assumptions. This was not a puppet king. This was not a symbol. This was a man who had spent his entire childhood studying what power looked like from underneath it, and who had decided, with the cold clarity that comes from watching your inheritance nearly stolen, that he would never be weak again. His attention turned to Rome, specifically to the Treaty of Nisibis, specifically to the map that showed Roman territory pressing against his capital like a thumb against a windpipe. He attacked Nisibis in 338 AD, Nisibis, the great Roman fortress city of northern Mesopotamia, the city the Romans called the Key of the East. He threw everything he had at it: siege engines, infantry columns, cavalry screens, the full weight of Persian military power. The walls held. He tried again in 346. The walls held again. In 350, he came back with more men, more machines, and a new idea. He dammed the river above the city, let the water build until it was a weapon, and then released it against the walls like a battering ram made of the Tigris itself. The walls shook, sections crumbled, and then the defenders repaired them and held. 3 attempts, 3 failures. The walls of Nisibis had become a kind of running insult, a monument to the limits of Persian power. But Shapur was not a man who learned nothing from failure. He pulled back from the frontier and turned east, and for almost a decade, the western border fell quiet, while he waged a different kind of war on the steppe. The Chionites were a confederation of nomadic horsemen from the eastern steppes, fierce, mobile, and entirely uninterested in the geopolitical ambitions of settled empires. They raided Persian territory the way weather raids a coastline, regularly, destructively, and without apology. Shapur fought them for years, and then, around 358 AD, he did something more interesting than defeating them. He made them an offer their king could not refuse. Grumbates, the Chionite king, would bring his horsemen to fight alongside Shapur against Rome. In exchange, they would share in the plunder and the glory. Grumbates agreed. Shapur had just added thousands of the finest light cavalry in the ancient world to an army that was already formidable. But the cavalry was not the weapon that would change everything. The weapon's name was Antoninus, and he was a Roman. By training, Antoninus was a financial official, an accountant essentially, working in the apparatus that kept the Roman frontier running. He was educated, organized, detail-oriented, and deeply, catastrophically in debt. The exact nature of his financial disaster is lost to history, but the consequences are not. Antoninus discovered that certain powerful Romans were preparing legal accusations against him, and that those accusations, if they landed, would destroy him. He had a choice. He could stay and face Roman justice, or he could run. He ran, but not empty-handed. Antoninus crossed the Tigris with his family and presented himself to Shapur's court, carrying something worth more than any treasure he could have stolen: complete, detailed, current knowledge of the Roman frontier defense system. He knew where every fortress was, how many men garrisoned it, what its weak points were, where the supply routes ran, which passes through the mountains were defensible and which were not, and, crucially, he knew about the underground passages that ran beneath the cliffs of certain fortress cities. The hidden stairways and drainage channels that engineers had cut into the rock, and which the Persians had never been able to discover through normal reconnaissance. Shapur had spent 60 years trying to find the crack in Rome's eastern armor. Antoninus handed him the architectural blueprints. The Roman commander on the eastern frontier was a man named Ursicinus, the Magister Equitum, the master of cavalry, one of the most senior military positions in the empire. Ursicinus was, by all accounts, including those of the junior officer who would later immortalize him in print, a first-rate general. Experienced, aggressive, tactically creative, and deeply loyal to the soldiers under his command. He was exactly the kind of man you wanted commanding your frontier when an existential threat appeared on the horizon. He was also, unfortunately, exactly the kind of man that the Emperor Constantius II most deeply distrusted. Constantius was not a bad emperor in all respects, but he had inherited a throne soaked in the blood of his own family. His father, Constantine, had watched brothers and cousins cut each other down, and the experience had warped his sense of loyalty into something permanently and pathologically suspicious. He trusted no general who was too successful. He trusted no commander who was too popular with his troops. And Ursicinus, gifted and admired, fit both profiles exactly. So when Ursicinus began sending urgent dispatches to court, warning that Shapur was massing an unprecedented force on the frontier, and begging for authorization to conduct a preemptive campaign, or, at minimum, to consolidate the frontier defences, the response from the imperial court was the same as it had been for years. Wait. Watch. Do not do anything that might look like ambition, and above all, do not move without explicit imperial authorization. The man nominally in charge of the entire Eastern military theatre was a general named Sabinianus, and where Ursicinus was aggressive and capable, Sabinianus was cautious to the point of paralysis. He kept his troops in comfortable winter quarters. He declined to conduct the kind of aggressive reconnaissance that might have detected Shapur's approach route earlier. And when Ursicinus proposed bold countermoves, Sabinianus declined to authorize them, citing standing orders from the emperor. The Roman eastern frontier in 359 AD was defended by talented men bound hand and foot by a command structure that rewarded caution and punished initiative. Meanwhile, Shapur was moving. In the spring of 359 AD, the Persian army began its western march, and the movement of it sent tremors through the frontier provinces. Refugees came first, farmers and shepherds who had seen the dust clouds and the distant glitter of armour, and who ran without waiting to count. Then came the stragglers from outlying posts, breathless men with wide eyes who described what they had seen in numbers that their commanders could not quite bring themselves to believe. Then came the reports from military scouts, and those reports confirmed what the refugees had said, and then added details that made the confirmation worse. Shapur was not conducting a raid. He was not running a punishing expedition. He was moving with the full weight of a civilization behind him, and his direction of march, guided, Ursicinus correctly suspected, by detailed information that no Persian commander should have possessed, was taking him around Nisibis entirely, skirting the fortress that had stopped him 3 times, and pointing like an iron finger at the broader Roman position in Mesopotamia. The cities and fortresses of the frontier filled with desperate people. Amida, with its sheer walls and its spring water and its experienced garrison, seemed the most logical place to make a stand. And so they came. Soldiers, civilians, refugees, the frightened and the resolute together, until the population behind Amida's walls swelled from 20,000 to something approaching 120,000 souls. The city built for 1 had been asked to hold 6. Outside, across the plain and the passes and the river crossings, a jewelled serpent kept moving west. Stand on the walls of Amida, and you understand immediately why the Romans chose this ground. The city sat on a raised basalt plateau, volcanic rock so dark it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Stone that had been cooking under the Mesopotamian sun for 10,000 years, until it was harder than iron and twice as heavy. On the south, the plateau dropped away in sheer cliff faces directly to the bank of the Tigris, making attack from that direction not merely difficult, but geometrically impossible without equipment that did not exist. On the east and north, the ground fell away in steep terraces of the same black rock, offering defenders on the walls a clear field of fire down onto any attackers who tried to approach. The western approach was the most accessible, and it was there that the engineers had concentrated their most formidable stonework. Double walls with a killing ground between them. Towers spaced at intervals that allowed overlapping fields of arrow fire, and artillery platforms that could reach any siege engine that tried to come within range. Inside the walls, the garrison was not simply large, it was diverse in a way that was both a strength and a complication. The anchor of the defense was the Legio V Parthica, Rome's 5th Parthian legion, stationed at Amida for years and as intimately familiar with every inch of the walls as a man is familiar with the rooms of his own house. They knew which stones had shifted in the last winter's frost, which towers had the best sightlines, where to concentrate during a push from the western approach, and where to thin the line when an attack from the north looked like a feint. They were home. Beyond the 5th Parthian, 6 additional legions or detachments had been swept into Amida by the tide of the Persian advance. Units displaced from other frontier posts, detachments that had been caught in the wrong place when the storm broke and had run to the nearest high ground. Among them were 2 legions with a particular history. The Magnentiani, soldiers recruited from Gaul under the usurper Magnentius and later absorbed into the regular Roman army. They were magnificent fighters, tall, broad, aggressive, with the particular fury that northern warriors brought to close combat. They had been born for open battle, for the shock of lines meeting in a field, for the kind of fighting where personal courage determined everything. Being shut inside a fortress while the enemy camped outside was not fighting in any sense they recognized or valued, and they made their frustration known in ways that would create serious problems before the siege was over. Inside the walls also, an elite unit of cavalry archers, the Comes Sagittarii, whose value in a siege was incalculable. These men could put an arrow through a slit in Persian armor at 200 paces, could maintain a rate of fire that turned an advancing column into a pincushion before it reached the walls, and could do it hour after hour without the decline in accuracy that came from the kind of muscle fatigue that plagued less disciplined shooters. They were, in military terms, force multipliers, men who could achieve with skill what numbers alone could not. And there were healers, engineers, supply officers, priests of a dozen religions, merchants who had not escaped in time, families who had nowhere else to run, and the terrified elderly who had chosen to die inside familiar walls rather than on the roads. They were all there together. 120,000 people in a space built for 20,000. And outside the walls, one of the greatest armies ever assembled in the ancient world was spreading itself around the perimeter like a noose being tightened 1 inch at a time. The Persian order of battle around Amida was a demonstration of Shapur's strategic brilliance. He did not simply surround the city. He organized the encirclement by nation and by military function, placing each contingent where its particular characteristics could be maximally employed. The Albanian cavalry went to the north, where the terrain rewarded the kind of mobile screen they provided best, cutting off any possibility of escape or resupply from the mountains of Armenia. To the east, Grumbates and his Kyanite horsemen settled into position. Light cavalry who could run down anything that tried to break out through the river crossings. Riders who had spent their lives on the steppe, developing a relationship with their horses that Roman cavalrymen spent careers trying to replicate. To the west, the Saka warriors from Sakastan anchored the most defensible approach, their heavy infantry providing the kind of sustained pressure that would pin the Roman defenders against the walls when the real assault came. And at the south, with the river behind them and the cliff faces above, Shapur himself took position with his household guard, the most elite unit in the Persian army, men selected for personal loyalty and fighting ability in equal measure, dressed in armor so elaborate that they seemed less like soldiers and more like mobile works of art. On the morning before the siege properly began, Shapur did something that revealed exactly how confident he was in his own power, and exactly how much he miscalculated the particular kind of stubbornness that had built Rome's empire in the first place. He rode forward. Not toward the flanks or the western approach where the serious fighting would happen. He rode toward the gate, the main gate of Amida, accompanied by his household cavalry in their glittering armour, and he stopped close enough that the defenders on the walls above could see his face under that extraordinary crown, close enough to read the expression of a man who has never considered the possibility that anyone in front of him might fail to yield. He was offering them terms. That was the message. Not in words. There was no herald, no white flag, but in the sheer audacity of the approach, in the spectacle of power made flesh and riding to their door, in the unmistakable language of a king who fully expected the gates to open. Submit. Open the gate. Surrender the city and save your lives, and the lives of everyone behind those walls. The Persian Empire is patient, but its patience has a boundary, and you are looking at it on horseback. The defenders of Amida gave him their answer in the oldest language of a besieged garrison. They shot at him. Arrows came down from the towers and the walls in a ragged, furious volley. Not a coordinated barrage, but the instinctive response of men who looked at the crowned figure below them and felt not awe, but outrage, not submission, but a hot and immediate rage. One arrow cut through the hem of Shapur's royal robe. Another struck his horse in the flank, and the animal shied hard enough to nearly unseat the King of Kings in front of his entire army. Shapur wheeled his horse and rode back to his lines, and those watching him from the walls could see, even at distance, even through the dust and the early morning light, the precise moment that his expression changed. That night, inside Amida, the sounds were not those of sleep. In the barracks that had been converted into overflow dormitories, soldiers of 6 different legions lay on whatever they had managed to claim: a cot, a rolled cloak, bare stone, and conducted the private rituals of men who understood what was coming. A legionary from the 5th Parthian sharpened his pilum point with long mechanical strokes, the sound of iron on stone, a kind of meditation he had performed 100 times before battles he had survived, and one that he performed now without quite letting himself think about whether this counted as a battle of the survivable kind. Near him, one of the Gallic soldiers from the Magnentiani sat with his back against the wall and his eyes closed, muttering something in a language none of the other men in the room understood. Gaulish, thick and consonant-heavy, a prayer or a curse, or perhaps both at once, directed at gods whose names the Roman legionaries had never learned. In the civilian quarters, a merchant, whose warehouse was now a sleeping hall for 40 refugees, sat with his children pressed against him, and stared at the ceiling and listened to the city breathe. On the walls, Ammianus Marcellinus stood his watch. He was a young officer, not yet the historian he would become, still several decades away from sitting down to write the work that would preserve this night and these days for every generation that followed. But he was already a man with the particular habit of the historian. He noticed things. He noticed the quality of the darkness over the Persian camp. Not true dark, but a dim orange glow from 10,000 campfires. A warmth visible in the night air that suggested not so much an army encamped as a city that had simply arrived. He noticed the sounds from across the lines, the distant chanting that might have been prayer, the occasional trumpet call that served no tactical purpose but was meant to be heard. And underneath it all, the low and continuous percussion of preparation, the sound of the greatest siege train ever assembled being moved into position in the dark. He noticed all of this and stored it away with the calm precision of a man who does not yet know he is recording history, but is too careful an observer to let it pass unrecorded. When the sun came up on the first full day of the Siege of Amida, the world looked different. Not because anything visible had changed in the night, but because every person on those walls knew, with the absolute certainty of people who had seen what was assembled against them, that when Shapur recovered from the indignity of the morning before, he was going to make them pay in a currency that had no change. He was going to spend his army against them until one of them ran out. The sound arrived before the light did, a low, rhythmic thunder, distinct from the natural sounds of a waking morning. Not thunder from clouds, not the Tigris in flood, but something mechanical and immense and deliberate. It was the Persian siege train coming into motion, the groan of ropes as great torsion engines were wound to maximum tension, the deep creaking of wooden frames carrying weights that ordinary wood was not designed to carry, the percussion of thousands of feet moving in practiced coordination across packed earth. By the time the sun had cleared the mountains to the east and the defenders on Amida's walls could see the Persian positions properly, the landscape below them had transformed overnight. Where the evening before there had been a vast encampment, there was now a siege city. Shapur's engineers, men who represented the accumulated siegecraft of one of history's most technically sophisticated civilizations, had spent the night constructing the infrastructure of destruction. Approach trenches zigzagged toward the walls, shallow at first and then deepening as they came closer, protecting the men who would work in them from the fire of the walls above. At the rear, great stone-throwing engines had been assembled on raised platforms, their throwing arms cocked and loaded, aimed at specific sections of Amida's fortifications, with a precision that suggested their crews had spent the night doing geometry. And moving slowly forward from the siege camp, still far but clearly approaching, were the towers. The towers were the centerpiece of Shapur's assault, and they announced their purpose by their construction. Enormous wooden structures built on rollers, their exteriors sheathed in iron plates to resist fire and resist the impact of stones thrown from the walls. Each tower was built high enough to overlook Amida's battlements, not to match them, but to dominate them, to give Persian archers and artillery crews a position from which they could shoot down onto the defenders rather than up at them. At the top of each tower, behind iron shutters that could be opened and closed like the eyes of some mechanical beast, sat a ballista, a heavy crossbow-like artillery piece capable of firing iron bolts with enough force to punch through the shields and armor of anyone on the receiving end, at distances that made individual marksmanship irrelevant. The first attacks came before the towers were fully in position. Persian infantry moved toward the walls in organized columns, protected by wicker screens and overlapping shields, moving fast enough that the defenders barely had time to shift their weight before the ladders went up. For a moment, for one terrible, lurching heartbeat, it seemed like the walls would be rushed by sheer mass. There were so many of them, packed so tight as they crossed the killing ground below the walls, that individual acts of defence seemed pointless against the tide of it. But the Comes Sagittarii had been waiting for exactly this. The cavalry archers of Amida opened from the towers and battlements with a coordinated fire that demonstrated precisely why they had been stationed here. Shafts coming in overlapping waves, timed so that as one group released, another was already drawn, creating a continuous curtain of death that the Persian infantry could not walk through without bleeding for every yard of progress they made. The attack broke. It reorganized. It came again. It broke again. By midday on the first day, the ground below the walls had been watered with Persian blood, and the defenders were still on the battlements. And Shapur had learned two things: that the direct assault would cost him more than he wanted to pay, and that the towers were going to be necessary. But the towers were not yet ready, and so began the first phase of a rhythm that would define the next several weeks. Persian pressure, Roman response, escalation and counter-escalation. The siege becoming not a single event, but a long and grinding conversation conducted in fire and iron and human cost. The towers, when they arrived, were immediately recognized by the defenders as the primary threat, and the garrison responded with a ferocity that surprised even experienced Persian siege commanders. The crew of one tower found themselves suddenly engulfed in flame when a detachment of Roman defenders made a night sortie specifically to attack the thing, cutting through the Persian picket line, piling combustibles against the iron-sheathed wood at the base, and lighting it before the guards could respond. The tower burned spectacularly, its iron exterior glowing red before the interior collapsed and the whole structure came down in a shower of sparks, visible for miles in every direction. The defenders who made it back to the walls were cheered by everyone watching. The defenders who did not make it back were mourned quietly, their names added to a list that was getting longer. On the eastern face of the walls, Grumbates and the Chionites made their first serious push. They attacked differently from the Persian regulars. No ladders, no structured columns, but a massive mounted assault designed to probe the defences with speed rather than weight, trying to find the spots where the wall's coverage was thin or the artillery crews were slow to respond. They found no such spots. The eastern walls were manned by experienced veterans who had dealt with horse archers for their entire careers and knew exactly how to angle their shields and time their own fire to maximize the Chionite casualties without exposing themselves unnecessarily. The Chionites pulled back. They would try again. But on that day, the eastern wall held. On the western face, the Saka infantry conducted operations with a patience that was, in its own way, more frightening than any direct assault. They moved their approach trenches forward by inches, digging at night when the defenders' visibility was limited, consolidating by day when any attempt to disturb their work would cost Roman casualties. They were building toward a point on the western wall, where their own intelligence, presumably provided by Antoninus, told them there was a structural consideration worth exploiting. They were in no hurry. They had supplies, they had manpower, and they had the certainty of men who know what they are looking for and know where to find it. By the end of the first week, the shape of the siege was becoming clear, and the shape of it was not good news for the defenders of Amida. By noon of the third week, the signs of strain were becoming visible inside the walls, in ways that military discipline could not entirely conceal. The population problem was the most immediate. 120,000 people in a city built for a fifth of that number placed demands on water, food, sanitation, and simple space that the garrison's logistical planning had never been designed to meet. The freshwater spring that made Amida theoretically sustainable in a siege was real and reliable, but not infinite. It could sustain the original garrison through an extended siege with careful rationing. But 120,000 people with full daily needs was a different calculation entirely. The civilians who had flooded the city before the Persian lines closed had brought some food and some livestock, but not enough for weeks, let alone months. The food stores that the military garrison had accumulated were being drawn down faster than anyone had wanted to admit. And in the crowded civilian quarters, where people slept pressed against each other in rooms meant for a quarter of their current occupants, the conditions that breed disease were assembling themselves with patient efficiency. Ammunition was also becoming a concern, not yet critical, but a concern that the supply officers noted in their reports, with the particular careful language of men who understand that the gap between a concern and a crisis can close very quickly. The Comes Sagittari's extraordinary rate of fire was consuming arrows faster than the city's Fletcher teams could produce them. The artillery on the walls went through stone shot and iron bolts at rates that had seemed sustainable in the planning documents and were proving in practice to be optimistic. Every day that the siege continued added to a deficit that could not be made up from within the walls. But the most dangerous development was what was happening with the Gallic legions. The Magnentiani had been watching the siege unfold for 3 weeks now, with a growing fury that their officers could feel but not entirely contain. These men were warriors in the most direct and personal sense. Men who measured their worth by what they could achieve at close range, with their own hands, against an opponent they could see and reach and fight directly. The siege was doing something to them that no enemy could have done. It was making them feel useless. They could see the Persian camps from the walls. They could see the siege engines. They could see the enemy soldiers moving through their approach trenches and building their assault infrastructure with the unhurried confidence of men who believe they have all the time in the world. And there was nothing to do about it. Nothing a man could do with a sword and a shield and 2 arms and 30 years of accumulated fury except stand on a wall and watch. Their officers tried to redirect the energy, assign them to tower defense, make them part of the sortie teams, give them something to do with their hands. But the Magnentiani were not men who could be easily redirected once they had decided what they wanted, and what they wanted was to go out through the gate and fight in a way that made sense to them. On a night in the middle of the 4th week, a detachment of them did exactly that. Went out through a postern gate, cut through the Persian picket line, and attacked a section of the siege works with a violence that the Persian guards had not expected from men coming out of a besieged city. They did considerable damage. They killed a respectable number of Persian engineers, and when they came back through the gate, their numbers were noticeably smaller than when they had gone out, and the damage they had inflicted, while real, was repaired by the next morning. Ursicinus watched all of this from outside the walls. He was not inside Amida. He had been caught outside the city when the Persian lines closed and now operated in the frontier territory beyond the siege perimeter, trying to find a way to be useful and running into the walls of Roman bureaucratic caution at every turn. He sent dispatches to Sabinianus. He outlined plans for a relief operation. Not a full relief, but a series of harassing strikes against the Persian supply lines that would force Shapur to detach troops to protect his logistics, thinning the siege lines. Sabinianus declined to authorize the operation. He cited the emperor's standing orders against taking unilateral action. He cited the risk of losing the relief force if Shapur responded in strength. He cited the strategic importance of maintaining a force in being for future operations. Ursicinus read these dispatches and understood with the clarity of a man who has spent a lifetime in military service exactly what they meant. Sabinianus was afraid,
and the emperor's standing orders had given him all the cover he needed to let fear make his decisions for him. Inside Amida, 20,000 soldiers and 100,000 civilians were learning that their empire had chosen this moment to stop moving. It was somewhere in the middle of the 5th week that the disease arrived. It came without announcement, as disease does. One man complaining of fever in the morning, 2 men the next day, 10 men the day after that. The garrison's surgeons identified it quickly. A fever with characteristics consistent with what ancient sources called plague, moving fast through the overcrowded civilian quarters, where the conditions for its spread were close to ideal. The military discipline that kept the legions functioning also kept them somewhat protected. Soldiers slept in organized barracks, not in the improvised heaps of the civilian overflow. But the city was too small and too crowded for any quarantine to be truly effective, and the fever spread. For 10 days it ran through Amida, taking the weak and the old and the unlucky. The dead were removed from the city by being thrown from the walls at night, when Persian attention was elsewhere. A grim logistics problem solved by grim logistics means. And then, with the timing of an event that seemed less like coincidence and more like the city had simply refused to accept one more disaster at that particular moment, the fever broke. A period of cooler weather, a brief rain that cleaned the streets and the cisterns, and the disease retreated as suddenly as it had arrived. The garrison counted its dead and went back to defending the walls. But everyone who had survived the fever was weaker for it, and Shapur's army was not weaker at all. Then came the night of the 70th tower and the 70 men inside it. It was sometime in the 3rd week of the siege. The exact timing is lost, preserved only in Ammianus's account, which describes the sequence of events with the precision of a man who was there, but the imprecision of a man who had other things to worry about at the time. What is known is this: there were underground passages beneath the walls of Amida. Rome built them in many of its frontier fortresses. Drainage channels, escape routes, hidden stairways cut into the living rock of the cliffs for purposes that might range from resupply to retreat. The passages at Amida ran through the basalt below the eastern cliff face, steep and dark and difficult to navigate, but navigable for a man who knew where he was going. Antoninus had told Shapur's commanders about them, and Shapur's commanders had identified among the defenders who had at some point come into Persian hands and been persuaded to cooperate someone who knew the route. 70 men. That was the number Shapur chose for the operation, a carefully selected team from his royal household guard, the finest soldiers in his army, men chosen for the combination of courage, physical capability, and discretion that an operation like this required. They went into the passage at night, guided by someone who knew the way, moving in absolute silence through stone corridors so tight that they had to turn sideways in places, climbing stairs cut into the rock of the cliff with nothing to hold on to but the faith that the guide knew where he was going. And they did not make for the walls directly. They made for one of the towers, specifically a tower on the eastern face whose upper stories could be accessed from the passage system, whose height gave a commanding view of the surrounding defences, and whose capture would create a point of fire inside the Roman perimeter that the defenders would be unable to ignore. They reached the tower. They climbed it floor by floor in the dark, moving past sleeping guards, or guards who were alert but looking outward rather than inward, because the possibility of enemies inside the walls had not seriously occurred to the garrison's security planning. By the time the first thin grey light of the coming dawn began to show at the arrow slits of the upper story, 70 Persian soldiers were in position at the top of a Roman tower, inside the walls of the city they had been attacking from outside for 3 weeks. They had no way to communicate their success to the army outside, so they communicated it in the oldest military language available. They hung a red robe from the top of the tower. The effect on Amida was immediate and catastrophic in the way that true fear is always immediate and catastrophic. The tower was inside the walls. The enemy was inside the walls. The one certainty that had made every other hardship bearable was suddenly not certain at all. There were Persians inside Amida. The tower was taken. The western view that the tower commanded was now a Persian position. Officers who had been calm under 3 weeks of sustained external attack found themselves dealing with something the training manuals had no real answer for. The enemy was already in the house. But the defenders of Amida had not survived 3 weeks of the greatest siege operation in a generation by being men who panicked. The response was organized with remarkable speed. Units that had been defending the outer walls were pulled back to form a cordon around the captured tower. The tower itself was isolated. No one went in or out, while the garrison's commanders assessed the threat and put together a plan. The plan, when it came, was simple and brutal. The 70 Persians in the tower had brought a finite number of arrows. When those arrows were gone, the tower would be attackable in a way it wasn't while the men inside were fully supplied. So the defenders waited. They maintained the cordon, absorbed the fire from the tower's arrow slits with shields and positioning rather than counterattacks, and held. The Persians in the tower shot their arrows, every one of them, and when the last arrow had been fired and the tower had gone quiet, the Roman assault teams went in. The fighting inside the tower was the kind of close-quarters violence that no amount of training fully prepares a man for. Combat in staircases barely wide enough for 2 men to pass, in rooms lit only by what light came through narrow slits, against opponents who knew they had no retreat and no quarter coming, and fought with the specific determination that such knowledge creates. The Persians sold their position at a price, in Roman lives, that their mission had probably required them to exact. But they were 70 men inside a tower that had been cut off from any resupply or reinforcement, and they were fighting against the organized weight of a garrison that had been angry and frustrated and looking for something to hit for 3 weeks. By the time it was over, the tower was back in Roman hands, and the 70 men who had taken it were all dead. But the passage had been used, and now Shapur's engineers knew it worked. The weeks that followed had the quality of a dream that keeps becoming more nightmarish the longer it goes on. Repetitive in its broad structure, always slightly worse in its specific details, with no clear moment at which it became unbearable, because it had been unbearable for so long that the normal baseline of experience had been recalibrated around a new and terrible normal. The garrison defended the walls. The Persian siege engines threw stones at the walls. The walls were repaired. The towers were defended. The sorties went out and came back smaller. The food supply declined. The water was rationed more strictly. The dead were removed, and the living took their places, and Shapur's army sat in its camps and waited with the patience of an entity that knew time was on its side. And then, on a day near the end of the siege's 6th week, Grumbates received word that his son was dead. The young prince, the son of the king of the Chionites, a young man who had ridden west with his father in the expectation of glory and plunder, and the particular education in war that princes of nomadic peoples received by going to war, had been killed in one of the attacks on the Eastern Wall. The exact circumstances are not fully preserved, but the fact is, he died under the walls of Amida, young, and without having accomplished the thing he came for. And for Grumbates, the king of a people for whom the obligations of grief and the rituals of honouring the dead were not ceremonial abstractions, but binding necessities, this was not a fact that could simply be processed and set aside. His son needed to be mourned properly. The army could not continue while the proper rites remained incomplete. Grumbates went to Shapur. What was said between them is not recorded.
What is recorded is the result, an agreement for a 7-day cessation of military operations to allow the Chayyanite mourning rites to be completed. Shapur, the man who had ridden to the gates of Amida and sworn to reduce it to rubble after taking an arrow through his robe, agreed. He stopped the siege for a week because his ally's son had died, and the proper thing to do about it was to stop. Inside Amida, the cessation of the siege's noise was more disorienting than the noise itself had been. For 6 weeks, the garrison had existed inside a continuous sensory experience of violence and threat. The sounds of the siege engines, the percussion of impacts on the walls, the calls and counters of military communication, the background noise of 120,000 people existing in extreme stress in very close quarters. And then, suddenly and completely, it stopped. The Persian camps were quiet. The siege engines were silent. From the eastern wall, where Grumbates had made his camp, the defenders could see and faintly hear the Chayyanite funeral ceremony. Fire, chanting, the sound of horsemen riding in circles around a central pyre in the nomadic fashion of farewell to the dead. It was, in its way, hauntingly beautiful, and more than one Roman defender on the walls found himself watching it with something that was not exactly sympathy, but was not entirely different from it either. They had 7 days of quiet, 7 days to repair what could be repaired, to rest what could be rested, to count their losses and assess what remained. The assessments were not encouraging. The garrison's strength had been reduced by weeks of combat, by the disease that had swept through, and by the sorties that the Magnentiani had insisted on conducting regardless of orders. The food supplies were now a serious rather than a theoretical concern. Not yet crisis level, but close enough that rationing had been tightened twice and would need to be tightened again. The walls were holding, but sections of them had taken significant damage from the Persian artillery, and the repairs, done under pressure and with limited materials, were not as sound as the original construction. The garrison was still fighting, but it was fighting with less of everything than it had started with. And on the evening of the 7th day, the Chayyanite funeral fires burned down to coals. And in the Persian camp, there was movement again. Not the movement of departure, but the movement of resumption. Equipment being repositioned, units being reorganized, siege engines being checked and prepared. The 7 days of quiet ended, and the grinding machinery of the siege restarted as smoothly as if it had never stopped. But something had changed in those 7 days, though no one on the walls of Amida knew it yet. Shapur's engineers had used the cessation to address a problem that had been vexing them for weeks. How to bring the siege to its conclusion before the autumn rains made further operations impractical. The answer they had developed was an earthen ramp. Not a ramp that simply approached the walls, but a massive construction that would rise to the height of the walls and create a broad, flat surface along which the Persian army could walk directly onto the Roman battlements without needing to climb ladders or breach gates. It was an old technique,
used by siege armies since the Assyrians, and it was effective precisely because it converted the walls from an obstacle into a ramp to the objective.
The work had been ongoing for weeks on the western approach, where the Saka infantry had been patiently extending their trenches. But in the 7 days of quiet, the engineers had made significant progress on the ramp's final approach, pushing it to within striking distance of completion. The construction continued. Day 70, Day 71, Day 72. The ramp grew. The defenders watched it grow and threw everything they had against the work parties, killing them by the dozens, but unable to stop the accumulation of packed earth that rose steadily against the western wall, like a slow tide that had decided to drown stone. On day 72, the ramp reached a height from which an assault was theoretically possible. Shapur's commanders prepared the final assault for the following dawn. They were not prepared for what happened instead. In the pre-dawn darkness of day 73, the ramp collapsed. Not because the defenders had done anything particular to it during the night, though they had certainly tried. Not because the engineering was fundamentally flawed, though the speed of construction in the final days had introduced compromises. It collapsed because earth is not stone, and packed earth, hastily accumulated, carries within it the seeds of its own failure. And this particular section of hastily accumulated packed earth had reached the precise combination of height, weight, and internal stress at which the seeds germinated. A section near the top, the newest work, where the earth was least compacted and the support most provisional, gave way and slid down, and the slide became a collapse, and the collapse created something that none of the careful Persian engineering plans had accounted for: a slope. Where the wall of packed earth had risen toward the Roman battlements at an angle that would have required assault troops to climb, the collapsed section now created a more gradual incline, still steep, still rough, still dangerous to cross under fire, but crossable in a way the original construction had never been. It was not a breach. It was not a ladder. It was something in between. An unintended gift of structural failure, a ramp where no ramp had been planned, a path that led from the Persian side to the Roman side, by the indirect route of human miscalculation. Shapur did not hesitate. The trumpet calls that shattered the pre-dawn quiet were not the calls of a scheduled assault. They were improvised, urgent, the sound of a commander recognizing opportunity and seizing it before the moment could close. From the 4 compass points of his encirclement, from every camp and every command post, the Persian army began to move. This was the moment that 60 years of Persian strategic ambition had been building toward. This was what 3 failed sieges of Nisibis and 10 years of patient preparation and the betrayal of Antoninus and the alliance with Grumbates and the 7-week siege that had cost 30,000 Persian lives had all been constructed to create. Not a breach in a wall, a gap. A momentary alignment of failure and opportunity that would not last beyond the next hour. The assault troops that hit the collapsed section first were the shock infantry of the Persian Royal Guard, men who had spent their careers training for exactly this kind of assault, who could cross broken ground at a run while maintaining the discipline to fight coherently once they reached the other side. They went up the slope in the dark, and the noise of 1,000 competing sounds, war drums, trumpets, the screaming of officers, the percussion of iron against stone, and the defenders on the wall above them shot into them and threw stones down at them and pushed at them with spears and did everything in the textbook of siege defense, because there was nothing left to do but the textbook. The Roman defenders fought with the particular ferocity of men who have been fighting for 73 days and know they are fighting the last day. Not with desperation, but with a cold, methodical violence that had been refined and concentrated by 10 weeks of constant pressure into something harder and more terrible than any fresh troops could have summoned. But there were not enough of them. There had never been enough of them. By dawn, and the sun was rising now, flooding the valley with that hard golden light that turns the black basalt of the plateau to amber and sets the river below on fire. The first Persian soldiers had reached the top of the collapsed section and were on the wall. There were not many of them yet. 5, then 10, then 20. But behind them came more, and behind those came the weight of the Persian army that had been waiting outside these walls for 73 days and was now released like water through a broken dam. What followed in the streets of Amida is preserved in Ammianus's account with the unsparingness of a man who was there and whose duty, he felt, was to record it truly. The fighting was not a battle in any organized sense. It was a dissolution, the collapse of military structure into pure violence, conducted in every street and courtyard and doorway of the city at once. The legionary units that had been on the walls fell back, in the disciplined Roman fashion, trying to form blocking positions, trying to buy time that no longer existed, for a purpose that was no longer achievable. The Gallic soldiers of the Magnentiani, freed at last from the walls that had penned them in, fought in the street with the ferocity they had always wanted to deploy. And died, as men die when they fight without position or advantage, with only courage to recommend them. The Come Sagittarii spent their last arrows from building tops and archways before being overwhelmed. The crowds were the worst of it. 120,000 people had been pressed into a space already overflowing, and now those people had nowhere to go, and the worst possible reason to try to go somewhere. The streets of Amida became rivers of humanity, moving in every direction at once. And the soldiers trying to fight in those streets found themselves not merely contending with Persian assault troops, but with the physical mass of a terrified population that had ceased to be individuals and had become something else, a tide, a pressure, a force as indifferent to what it ran over as actual water. Ammianus saw the moment that defined it all. He recorded it with the precision of trauma. A soldier beside him, struck by a sword blow with enough force to decapitate him, the body remaining upright in the press of the crowd, held vertical by the bodies on all sides, unable to fall because there was no room to fall. The dead standing among the living, a man who could no longer be killed because he was already dead and did not yet know to lie down. Ammianus looked at this and kept moving, because there was nothing else to do, and the image stayed with him for the rest of his life, and found its way into his history, and from there into every account of this day that has been written in 1600 years since. He ran. The city fell as the sun reached its height, and the sounds of it, the sounds of a place that had held for 73 days, finally releasing everything it had held, carried across the Tigris Valley and into the hills beyond, where a Roman officer who had spent 10 weeks trying to find a way to help was listening. Ursicinus heard Amida fall. He had no doubt what the change in sound meant. He had been a soldier long enough to know the difference between a city under siege and a city being taken. Inside the walls, the final accounting was being conducted in the way of conquerors since the beginning of cities, by fire and by ownership. Persian soldiers moved through streets that had been contested ground for 10 weeks, and were now Persian territory. And what they found, they took, and what resisted them, they destroyed. And the population that had been 120,000 was now either dead or captive
or in very rare cases, escaped.
The garrison of 20,000, the Legio V Parthica and its 6 attached units, the Comes Sagittarii and the Gallic infantry and all the rest, was effectively gone. Some died on the walls, some died in the streets, some were taken prisoner. The number of survivors who escaped in any organized way was very small. Among the very smallest group of escapees was Ammianus Marcellinus, who got out through a postern gate in the confusion of the final hours, ran 15 miles through enemy-patrolled territory in the dark without quite knowing how he avoided capture, and reached a point of relative safety where he collapsed and lay still for some time, and then, eventually, got up and kept walking. He was carrying nothing. He had left everything behind except his memory, which was extraordinary, and his habit of noticing things, which could not be left behind. The Persian casualties were assessed by the defenders' accounts and the archaeological evidence of the siege. The density of Persian dead in the killing ground below the walls, in the approach trenches, at the base of the collapsed ramp, and in the streets of the final assault. And the total settled somewhere around 30,000 men. 30,000 Persian soldiers dead over 73 days for a city of perhaps 40,000 in peacetime. Shapur had won Amida. He had paid for it in a currency that could be quantified. 30,000 lives, 73 days of operational time, and the momentum of a campaign that had been intended to range deep into Roman territory, but that now, with the autumn rains approaching, needed to stop. The soldiers of the garrison of Amida had not saved their city, but they had taken 30,000 Persians with them, and they had consumed more than 2 months of the Persian campaigning season. And those two things together had consequences that neither the defenders nor the attackers could fully calculate in the hours after the fall. The streets of Amida fell quiet in the way that places fall quiet after violence. Not the quiet of peace, but the quiet of exhaustion. The particular silence of a place that has used up everything it had and now has nothing left to make noise with. The bodies of the dead lay in the places where they had fallen. The fires that had been set burned down to coals. The animals that had survived the siege, the few horses, the livestock that hadn't been eaten, moved through the empty streets with the bewildered purposefulness of creatures who do not understand what has happened, but can sense that the rules have changed. Shapur rode through the gate that had never opened for him willingly, on the horse that had been wounded by Roman arrows 73 days ago, wearing the crown of ram's heads and rubies, and looked at what he had won. He ordered the entire surviving population of Amida, some 20,000 civilians who had endured the siege and the sack, deported to Khuzestan in the Persian heartland. Families who had lived in Amida for generations, merchants whose warehouses were rubble, farmers whose fields were outside the walls and whose homes were inside them. All of them were marched east, into the Persian Empire, into a future they had not asked for. Amida would be repopulated with Persian subjects. The city that had been Rome's iron door on the Tigris would become a Persian administrative centre. The transformation was deliberate and total. Ursicinus, when the news of the fall reached him in full, wrote his report and sent it to Constantius, and began the process of preparing his defence against the charges of negligence and dereliction that he correctly anticipated would follow. He was right to anticipate them. He was removed from command and court-martialed. With a particular Roman talent for assigning blame downward in a chain of command, the man who had been most right about the threat, who had proposed the most sensible responses, who had been blocked at every turn by superiors determined to do nothing, was held responsible for the nothing that had been done. The charges were eventually dismissed,
But Ursicinus's career was broken. He retired from active command and spent the rest of his life in the careful obscurity of a man who knew too much about where the fault actually lay and understood that saying so would accomplish nothing. Sabinianus continued in his command. Nothing was done to Sabinianus. What Amida meant took years to become visible, but when it became visible, it was impossible to ignore. The immediate strategic consequences cascaded from the fall of the fortress with the logic of dominoes. Singara, the next great fortified city on the eastern frontier, fell to Persian pressure in the years immediately following. Other frontier posts, watching what had happened to the place that had been considered impregnable, recalibrated their expectations accordingly. The defensive line that Rome had been holding since the Treaty of Nisibis, the line that Constantius II and his generals had spent 20 years assuring themselves was permanent and reliable, developed cracks that could not be repaired with stone and mortar, because they were not cracks in stone and mortar. They were cracks in confidence, and confidence, once cracked, does not simply heal with time. The full reckoning came in 363 AD, when the Emperor Julian, brilliant, impulsive, the last great pagan emperor of Rome, led an army east in an attempt to settle the Persian question once and for all. He marched to Ctesiphon, Shapur's capital, and fought a brilliant engagement in the field, and won it, and found himself standing outside a city he could not take with an army that had outrun its supply lines and a Persian force that had learned, from 73 days outside Amida, exactly how to let time and distance do what direct combat could not. Julian was killed in the retreat, stabbed by a spear from the dark, the circumstances disputed, the death absolutely not. And his successor, Jovian, signed the peace treaty that the Treaty of Nisibis had been designed to prevent. Everything Rome had gained in 298 AD went back to Persia. Nisibis, the 5 provinces beyond the Tigris, the strategic position that had kept Persian ambitions bottled up for 60 years. Gone. Traded for safe passage home. Shapur II outlived the humiliation of having a Roman emperor ride to his walls, and survived the complicated aftermath of that campaign to die in 379 AD at the age of 70, having ruled the Sassanid Empire for longer than anyone before or after him. He achieved, at the end of his long life, approximately everything he had set out to achieve at its beginning. The Treaty of Nisibis was erased. The frontier was returned to something approaching the lines of his grandfather's time. Rome would never again press so close to Ctesiphon. He had been, by the standard of what he was attempting, a success. But the cost had been 30,000 men outside Amida. The lesson of Amida that military historians have returned to across 16 centuries is deceptively simple and persistently unlearned. A fortress is not as strong as its walls. It is as strong as its weakest secret, and secrets in the world of armies and empires and border officials with financial problems have a way of finding their way to the people they are most meant to be kept from. Antoninus, the indebted accountant who crossed the Tigris with his family and his knowledge, had undone in a single act of betrayal what a century of engineering had built. The walls of Amida had held against 3 Persian kings and their siege engines. They had fallen to a man with a debt and a map. The stones were not the problem. The people who knew the stones were the problem. The deeper lesson, the one that Ursicinus understood from his tent outside the siege lines, and that history would confirm repeatedly from Amida to Constantinople to every fortress that has ever fallen to a besieging force, is that the human failures that bring down walls are rarely the failures of the defenders inside them. They are the failures of the commanders behind them. Sabinianus could have sent a relief force. Constantius could have authorized action. The Roman administrative and military system, which had been sophisticated enough to build Amida and to garrison it with 20,000 experienced soldiers, was not sophisticated enough, or not honest enough, to acknowledge that the system only worked if the people running it were willing to take risks commensurate with the threats they faced. The garrison of Amida took every risk available to them. They fought for 73 days against 100,000 men. They burned siege towers. They repelled cavalry charges. They contained a tower infiltration. They survived plague. They endured deprivation and overcrowding and the knowledge that no one was coming. They were 20,000 people who held the full weight of history on their shoulders for 2.5 months. And when they finally went down, they went down still fighting. That is not a defeat. That is something else entirely. Something that does not have a clean name in the military vocabulary of victory and defeat. Something that lives in the space between the two, where real history actually happens. The garrison of Amida did not save Amida, but they made Shapur pay for it in a currency he could never entirely afford. And they bought their empire a reckoning it could not use, because the men running the empire were not the men defending its walls. Ammianus Marcellinus, who had run 15 miles through enemy-patrolled darkness and then collected himself and kept walking, eventually made it back to Roman territory. He served for a few more years in the army and then retired from military service and began to write. He wrote in Latin, in the tradition of Tacitus and Livy, with the ambition of a man who understood that what he had witnessed deserved to be permanent. His history of Rome, the res gestae, the things that were done, covered the period from 96 AD through the catastrophic Roman defeat at Adrianople in 378 AD. And in the middle of it, taking up more space than any comparable event in the work, was his account of the Siege of Amida. He had been there. He had stood on the walls. He had watched the Persian camps burn like an inverted galaxy on the plain below. He had seen the red robe hung from the captured tower. He had been in the streets at the end and had looked at a dead man held upright by the press of the dying and kept moving because there was nothing else to do. He wrote it all down. He wrote it with the precision of a man trained to observe and the emotion of a man who had survived something that most of the people who experienced it had not survived. And he wrote it in a language that would be read for as long as languages are read. And because of that act, because one man who was standing in the right place at the worst possible time happened to be a man with the habit of memory and the discipline to put it into words, we know. Centuries later, the black basalt walls of Amida still rise above the Tigris Valley in the city now called Diyarbakir in southeastern Turkey. The Roman engineering that faced 3 Persian armies and held for 73 days against the greatest siege force the ancient world had assembled is still visible in the foundation stones, still solid under the touch of a hand placed against them. Tourists walk along the walls that Shapur's engineers built their ramps against. Scholars photograph the towers where 70 Persian archers hung a red robe and waited for dawn. The river below catches the light in the afternoon, exactly as it caught the light when Ammianus stood above it in the last watches of the night before the final assault, writing nothing down because there was no time, but storing everything because there was no alternative. The empires that fought over this ground are gone. Rome is gone. Sassanid Persia is gone. The Treaty of Nisibis that started everything, and the Treaty of 363 AD that ended it, are documents in archives, studied by specialists in dead languages. Shapur II is a name in a history book. Ursicinus is a name in a history book. Antoninus, whose crossing of the Tigris with a map and a secret set all of it in motion, is a name in a history book, mentioned briefly and without eulogy. But the walls remain, and somewhere in the stone of them, in the volcanic black basalt that the Romans chose because nothing harder existed in that landscape, is the record of 73 days in which 20,000 soldiers held 100,000 at bay, with nothing but skill and courage and the refusal to stop, and proved, in the end, that the greatest fortress ever built can fall, and that when it does, it falls not to the army outside the walls, but to the truth that was always inside them.